Hi guys, thanks for tuning into Radio Visca. This is Magnus here, and today I've got with me Tom Warrell again to join me for a discussion about a few current affairs, current topics. The first thing we want to talk about is the new Spielberg movie Ready Player One. Tom, you've seen the trailer for it. You haven't actually seen the movie. I saw the movie 2 days ago, but I thought I'd get your impressions about the trailer first off.
My initial impression was how spectacular it is, and it appears to be appealing to a younger audience. You've also got what's a fairly standard adversarial narrative whereby machines are used for and against the benefit of a good, so-called good society. So there appears to be a moral element and potentially a little bit of predictive programming in there. But I haven't seen the full movie, so I don't know exactly what that moral argument would be. But I do remember seeing a interview of Steven Spielberg quite a while ago, where he said that movies and television were the best weapon they have ever had. And I just wondered during that interview who he meant by they and why movies and television could be used as a weapon. So perhaps that fits into this particular movie, although I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So this interview with Steven Spielberg, do you remember what it was about, or where did you see that? Do you remember exactly?
Yeah, actually, I can't remember off the top of my head. It was a long time ago. I mean, maybe 10 years ago or so. And what it suggested to me, I can't give you the exact source, but what it suggested to me was that he is aware that movies, although could be used as a way to entertain and as an industry to make money, could also be used to program people's behaviours, thoughts, opinions, beliefs about particular subjects, not only real life sort of events and history, but also maybe their moral compass and their idea about what's right and wrong, what's considered to be good and bad, what's acceptable, and what the limits of that good and bad behaviour are. Clearly, you've got movies like Back to the Future which do appear to be based on entertainment only, but there are other movies that Spielberg's been involved with which are more to do with, or at least have these moral undertones and the potential to program.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Back to the Future. I haven't seen it in a while, but the movie Ready Player One features the DeLorean, which is the time machine from Back to the Future. So he's sort of being self-referential in this movie making, and that there's this interesting idea that there's this new genre in cinema called recognition cinema, where basically you pepper a movie with all these references to other movies, and it's a sort of the appeal of the film is kind of like a what now in internet parlance is bugmanism, right? So this sort of fake culture of manufactured heroes, manufactured memes, manufactured narratives, manufactured fandom, essentially, right? So he's doing that very heavily. Like basically, Ready Player One is it's absolutely peppered with pop culture references, and the book that it's based on obviously as well. But I mean, obviously Spielberg gets to choose which books he makes movies of, right? So he specifically chose this pop culture reference heavy book to make, and I think there's upwards of 100 different movies and video games and TV series and comics referenced in the film. So it's clearly what one could deem recognition cinema. What culture does that come from, or what culture is that sort of engaging? It's engaging the sort of Comic-Con culture, the cosplay culture, the comic book culture, the video game sort of gamer culture, and what's important about that is it's certainly an by and large an American-centric culture, but it's also a global culture. So if you think about what kind of cultural phenomena have been global in the past, I don't think there have been any true global cultural phenomena until video games. Even if you look at pop music like Beatles, Elvis Presley, whatever, that's largely a Western and even Anglo-Saxon phenomena. Yes, you had some fans of Elvis Presley in France and Germany as well, but it wouldn't have been a huge thing in India, for example. It wouldn't have been a huge thing in China, right? It wouldn't have been a huge thing in Iran or Nigeria. And even there, I'm sure there are people that appreciate Elvis Presley or the Beatles, but previous pop culture in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s was still a Western affair. Whereas video games today are very much a global affair. Certainly when there's Dota or the newest Super Mario, whatever, that's consumed on the entire planet, and especially in China, and also very heavily in Russia, and in the Middle East and so on. So what struck me about it was that there's this manufacturing of a global entertainment culture, which maybe Hollywood previously was only to a certain degree, and through the use of gaming, where obviously with computer programs, the different language versions, they come out at the same time, and you don't really need to know the language as well to play a video game like Mario or Counter-Strike, right? It's language and culturally agnostic almost, right? Whereas movies actually to some degree are not culturally agnostic. So yeah, that's the number one thought that I had about Ready Player One when I saw it. I don't know. Can you think of other movies or other parts of the sort of American manufactured culture where that's now the case, or is it really just video games? To me, at the moment, I can only think of video games, but maybe hip hop culture. I don't know.
I'm trying to think of some specific examples that support the idea of a globalized culture or a universal culture that's being promoted through Hollywood. I haven't seen that many Hollywood movies recently, but what I have noticed is within the hero genre, for example, the DC or the Marvel universe, what's being increasingly shown within those movies is a diverse ethnic team. So occasionally you might have one or two white lead characters, but the younger generation in particular will be of various different ethnicities. I remember seeing the most recent Wolverine movie, and there are a large number of sort of adolescent age mutants in that who are very much ethnically diverse, so whites being in a minority. So there's that, within the sort of...
That was Logan, right?
Yeah, that was Logan. So, within a lot of the more recent movies, which are, sold to a global market, you are almost in a sense preparing the younger generation, particularly of whites, to be prepared to be in a minority, and also to accept that as a good thing, because those diverse young people are always shown to be on the good side, as it were. Whereas, the villains can be ethnically diverse, but not all the time. So that's one element of how the modern movie industry has kind of put some kind of more cultural themes into its narrative without necessarily overtly pushing that narrative. In a sense, it's more, as I think the word is predictive programming, which is preparing an audience or a population for certain things through familiarization. And one thing I think why movies and perhaps gaming culture as well are so powerful at doing that is that we as humans have this almost insatiable desire for narrative, for stories, for individuals who we can relate to or identify with, who have done amazing things or who support certain moral principles or who overcame adversity. Even going back to any kind of native tribal system, you'll have a series of myths or of historical figures who would be spoken about in high regard, promoted, and their life story and the challenges that they overcame would be discussed in detail. And part of that is because we have this interest in hearing narratives that inspires us, but also it builds a kind of culture and identity, and also a moral and ethical framework. So, the Jesus narrative is one of those moral and ethical frameworks. If you look at the pagan narrative, the Eddas, it's all about certain behaviours like bravery or courage or tenacity or intelligence, being smart, overcoming an adversary through wit. All of those things are kind of promoted as being powerful and as something which the tribe or the people should take inspiration from. If you traverse the time to today, and you look at the kind of narratives that are being pushed, for instance, through the superhero culture, what you've got is a much more there's always a moral narrative because that seems to inspire people. There's always someone who's held out as being the good and overcoming evil. But it's often the case that evil that's being overcome is kind of almost boilerplate. Like there's no real, in comparison to say the Jesus narrative or the old Eddas, there's no real driving ethic other than to save humans from danger, if you see what I mean.
Right. That's actually quite interesting in Ready Player One, because we do have this fairly boilerplate by now enemy, right? Like the evil, the bad guy. So the bad guy in Ready Player One is called Nolan Sorrento. Incidentally, the initials of that is NS. And Nolan Sorrento is played by Ben Mendelsohn, who's I think an Australian part Jew. I think he's a quarter Jew. But he's clearly playing. He's got blue eyes. He's clearly playing an Aryan in the movie. Very white man, white male, and he's a corporate white male as well, right? In a corporation, he's interested in obtaining power. He's interested in furthering the success of his company, and he's interested in making money, right? So to paint those desires as evil strikes me as very communist, really, right? And there's an interesting scene in there where the Wade Watts character is he rallies all the other gamers to sort of appear and take down this force field, and he raises his fist in a fist bump, similar to the Black Panthers essentially, which to me is a very leftist Marxist kind of gesture, right, as opposed to the Roman salute, which is a fascist gesture. It's interesting how close they are, though, right? There's only a slight angle difference there, and a fist versus an open hand. That iconography, that imagery strikes me as deeply like communist in a way, right? There's this subtle communist narrative in Ready Player One that this revolutionary, anti-success, anti-profit, anti-corporate, making money, being powerful, gaining power type narrative, and this the Nolan Sorrento character is a caricature of powerful, successful white male in a corporate world, right? I mean, he's going around hunting kids on the internet with a gun, right? Like, and he's trying to blow up these kids that run this Oasis internet world, and I mean, just doesn't make sense, really, right? There's all these really childish kind of distortions of reality. Right? The noise is really annoying. I hope the listeners can't hear the whatever. Is that a leaf blower? That's a leaf blower. Yeah, hopefully that's not going to be too bad. But yeah, so that was one thing that I noticed. In terms of other things I noticed in the film, should we take a break maybe until it's over? Yeah, we'll take a break. Yeah. Alright, looks like the leaf blower guy has left. So where were we? We were talking about the boilerplate nature of the bad guy in Ready Player One. I was kind of describing his how certain qualities that to me make for a you know, basically if you have a little kid or like a boy watching these kind of movies, right? The impression they take away from it is that being a successful white male in a suit who's trying to have more profit for his corporation is an evil thing, and that the good people, the moral people, the moral thing to do, they all just play in this Oasis virtual reality game and hang out with people of all races, and you know, the only kind of slight moralizing in the film is that maybe you shouldn't be in virtual reality all the time. So there's this sort of a thing at the end that the players, you know, they've done this revolution. They've taken over the Oasis, right? Parzival, the lead character, has found the Holy Grail, and he's now obtained ownership of the Oasis. But of course, he's shared it with his clan, so to speak. So with all the other players. So he's immediately done the sort of egalitarian thing rather than trying to dominate it for himself or just keeping that right to ownership himself. And one of the rules that they institute is that the Oasis closes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I think, or Tuesdays and Wednesdays, because you know you don't want kids to be in the Oasis 24/7, right? You need to be in the real world 2 days of the week. I mean, it just struck me as I was flabbergasted by that ending, to be honest, right? I mean, it seemed like what kids are basically being indoctrinated into thinking is that, yes, being in virtual reality and playing video games is really important. That's where the important decisions in the world are made. That's where you can fight for the future. And the only thing is, just don't do it all the time. You know, 5 days a week is enough. Have 2 days rest. I mean, what do you think of that?
I think if you were a big controller of international finance and interests, then it would certainly be within your interest to have a complacent youth who are only really focused on, or mainly focused on, enjoying themselves through technology, because if they do think like that, then they're not going to engage in any real issues, and they're going to continue to consume those products without really questioning or becoming active in any significant social movements. But I think the driving, you know, the moral themes that are pushed are channeling any moral outrage or significant moral interest against essentially success or financial success within the corporate world. So if you look at other movies as well, like Avatar or the Terminator series or the Alien series, the big bad evil is always the corporation, never the state. And that in my view, focuses the young people's attention on the idea that the big bad evil in the world is essentially business activity, not potentially the encroaching powers of the state, and potentially channels people more towards a Democratic Party line of we're good because we can control the market and provide more equal outcomes for people regardless of their ability or their success in the financial sphere. I think as well what's promoted is a very, as you say, like a disconnected culture whereby young people are only identifying in video games, not their own traditions and heritage, not the traditional sort of moral themes within pagan or Christian morality. For example, you look at Avatar, the tribe of people who are held up as being good are very much kind of, I guess you'd say, almost a jungle kind of African style culture, which doesn't really resemble what traditional European societies would look like, and that's the form of rebellion. It's either a socialist rebellion or a kind of non-European rebellion that's held up against the corporate interest. So yeah, I think you've definitely got some themes there. You've got a kind of disempowerment through hedonism of the youth, a focus on technology, not on real issues, a potential channeling towards a socialist kind of mindset, or at least an international socialist anti-corporate mindset, and it's quite pervasive. I mean, you rarely see any real criticism of, for instance, even though they're US movies, of the potential power of the state over, or being the bad guy. It's always the big corporation.
Yeah. So I think you're quite correct there. I mean, you've expressed that in a very succinct way, and you've brought the state in which I hadn't sort of thought about as much until now. And yes, certainly the state is actually completely absent in Ready Player One until the end. And in the end, the only way that you actually any kind of state activity is presented is that the bad guy, Nolan Sorrento, is arrested by the police. So Nolan Sorrento, he's done all these evil deeds. He's been chasing these kids with a gun, and then the police come and arrest him. So essentially, the idea, obviously, there is that the state are the good guys, right, and that corporations are the bad guys. Now, I mean, there's this interesting dichotomy in the movie between the oasis and reality as well. So, what is not at all critiqued, and this is something that's quite interesting. So there's imagery, and there are moments of what I would deem visual critique of this sort of virtual reality future. So there's no explicit criticism in words. There's no character that's waxing philosophically about the time before virtual reality, before everyone's in this oasis. There's no, I mean, to me, that world just seemed horrible, right? Absolutely miserable and horrible, and yet in the movie there's virtually no one really critiquing it. Nevertheless, there are a few scenes where you sort of see, the negative aspects of it. So you see, for example, people spending all their time in the oasis and neglecting their children. There's this funny scene where there's this mum playing with a virtual reality headset on, and behind her there's like the cooking is burning and the baby's like screaming, and then there's another scene where there's sort of, I think, aunt of the main character is dating this guy that wastes all the money in the oasis, and she's always angry at him. and you can see all these people on the streets with headsets on. They're sort of like zombies, right? They're sort of in this. It's this absurdity of everyone like dancing around in the Matrix, essentially, in the street, right? Like they look like total imbeciles, right? Um, I have heard the movie described as the reverse Matrix, essentially. So in other words, this is let's all go into the Matrix. Let's all. That's where the important things actually happen, and that's where we can fight power. In the Matrix, we need to all spend our time in there. We need to fight in there, and if we take it over, then the world is a better place. Except for Tuesdays and Thursdays where we should have some free time. you know, it's funny because I'm trying to I'm of two minds of what Steven Spielberg's actually doing there, right? Like, is he adding these little hints of criticism? They're really short usually. They're just these little, like in terms of editing, they maybe last for 5 seconds or so. You see these snapshots of how terrible the world is in between all these amazing, beautiful images of within the oasis, right? It just cuts to the real world and how miserable the real world is, and you only ever see that briefly for 5 seconds or so. So what's going on there? Is he sort of is he providing a glimpse to the more intelligent people? To the is he sort of doing a little bit of samizdat? A little bit of what do you call it? Culture jamming. The in between the lines. Like, what is his intention, or is it? Or could you judge this as a sort of like karma thing, right? It's like, okay, this is what we're offering you. We're not going to completely hide what's coming towards you. Look, if you look closely, that's what's coming towards you. The reality of the stacks in Columbus, Ohio, these people living in stacked up trailer parks, this diversity on the street with graffiti and trash everywhere, everyone's stuck in this headset and no work being done. Everyone's spending their entire time in the oasis and not improving their own physical material environment at all, right? I mean, that's the insidious thing about it. There's these one thing that clearly is an intentional criticism in the story is that there's these things called loyalty centers, and a loyalty center is it's kind of like how they have these gold mining farms in Bangladesh and India where they have people play World of Warcraft and there's basically grinding for gold. They're just doing all the things that get you more kind of in-game currency. And these loyalty centers are basically that. They take people who are in debt and they put them into these virtual reality kind of prisons, and they get them to grind in the game until the debt's paid off. But really the only difference between what these people in this virtual reality prisons are doing and what the people in freedom, in quotation marks, are doing is that in the game world they are told what to do, essentially, by soldiers, by guards. Both the free people, so to speak, and the people in the loyalty centers, though, are spending their entire day in the virtual world. So it struck me as, like, I don't know if other people are noticing it. I didn't get the sense that the audience in the cinema was, like, noticing that. Like, I didn't, from just overhearing people going out, like, they all felt like, yeah, being in the loyalty center is terrible, but being in the Oasis game world is great, right? Like, there's this sort of blue pill kind of trajectory to the movie where there's none of the caution of the Matrix, essentially. There's none of the critique or the, like, this is wool that's been pulled over your eyes, right? So there is a certain level of acceptance of this new virtual world in the movie, and yeah, I wonder if that is something that I'm noticing there, where Steven Spielberg is doing a bit of predictive programming. He's sort of normalizing virtual reality, because we have to remember that virtual reality at this point in time is not yet fully normalized, right? Most people don't use it. Most people don't use headsets yet. Certainly not haptic bodysuits. But as far as I can see, it's certainly something, a direction that gaming has taken. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a book by Aldous Huxley, which is quite an old book now, called Brave New World, and it's a bit like Orwell's 1984 in a sense, in that it sets out a scenario where you've got an almost entirely planned society. So you've got a small elite class running the society, and through methods like gene selection, like inhibited growth, promiscuity, but also the proliferation of mind-numbing drugs, the population and its behaviour is completely controlled from the top down. And the drug in question is some kind of opioid or something like that called Soma. But it appears to me that if you were to be in a powerful position and you did want to control a population, then it wouldn't only be drugs that would be a way to kind of dumb people down, make them complacent, and make them not sort of interact or react to events in the real world. What you could also use is this kind of high-tech engagement in a virtual world, for instance through computer games or movies, whereby people are kind of like cows chewing the cud of their entertainment and technology and not engaging in the real world. And it's interesting that this movie seems to promote that as not only being normal, but as being a positive desire, as in people should desire and focus their time and attention on essentially living outside of reality. And it's also curious that that's being promoted at a time when we've got post-industrial societies. I mean, particularly in the US and the West, you've got less and less sort of industrial jobs for people who maybe are low-skilled or low-skilled, or who have done those jobs traditionally. And potentially a form of Soma for those people is to buy a cheap Xbox or a second-hand Xbox, or to go online and start streaming through these movies and be fabulously and wonderfully entertained by this world, which, as you say, looks far more impressive than the real world that they see outside, whereby they're becoming an ethnic minority and there aren't really that many economic opportunities. And I think it's important to point out what people miss out on when they do either engage in drugs and become somatos, or they do kind of use the crack cocaine of video game addiction to mask maybe deficiencies or things that they're not really getting from the real world. For instance, before, say in the 1950s or before then, children would normally expect to be playing outside, interacting with each other in a personal way, whereas now I think you've got a lot more kids who are just constantly engaged with tablets and media and not learning those social and personal skills and connections, which I think are fulfilling personally and give people a sense of identity and community, but also build a strong ego and give them skills of negotiation and people skills going into the workplace, which make them more competent and resilient individuals. But as well as that, if you're playing computer games, you're not thinking about being thrifty, personal success, working hard, spending time with family, community, having a family, religious beliefs, or more principles like liberty, for example, or liberty from the state. And potentially it is a way of masking or disengaging from a miserable life where those things aren't being achieved. And I think it's from what you've described, it sounds like there's this sort of utopian hub where children can come and play and be entertained and have this wonderful life. But as one movie that's animated movie that struck me as being comparable to that, but carrying a completely different sort of morality, was the old movie Pinocchio, which I believe is a Disney movie, in the times when Disney was actually run and owned by Mr. Disney. And in that movie, you have Pinocchio, who turns up at an enormous pleasure centre on an island. I think it's literally called Pleasure Island, where there are him and a lot of other boys his age, sort of adolescents and children, who are given unlimited tobacco, lots of beer to drink, lots of entertainment, lots of bars, pool, and all these big arcade type amusements and amusement rides like roller coasters, where they can just continuously have a good time and enjoy themselves, not think about tomorrow, not think about what's more important in life, not think about things like family, rescuing their father, and morality, and disengage essentially from their responsibilities to themselves for their own personal improvement and their community. And in that movie, what's shown is that actually Pleasure Island is run by a very sinister group of men who have somehow bewitched the island to make the boys ultimately turn into donkeys and then be sold into slavery as working donkeys. So there's this horrific kind of moment where everything starts to go quiet, and one by one the boys start turning into donkeys, and Pinocchio grows these big pairs of ears and a tail. And it's an obvious and serious moral lesson, which is, if you disengage from reality, if you seek pleasure and hedonism through personal entertainment and also through drugs, then that's going to have a very detrimental effect not only on you, but also you're going to become a slave to the people who run these things, run these camps, run these sins. So, if you compare the two, you're actually on the one hand, this technological virtual reality utopia is being promoted now, whereas before, a kind of comparable utopia is actually shown as a moral and personal hazard to be avoided, because there are much more important things. And also, I think, it's not only you're seeing in the real world, not only a kind of an engagement with computer games, but also, interestingly, in real life. I remember when I was living in London, there was what became very popular was what's called a silent rave, where people come together and put on headphones and are in a room all dancing to the same music, but there's no loud dancing, so they're interacting with their headphones on. So in a way, it's this virtual kind of disengagement from actual, a combined experience. So it's, on the one hand, you can't take it too seriously, because these technologies are amazing and they are great to indulge in and to enjoy. But I think, and Spielberg does point out that there's this woman who's neglecting her baby, but potentially that you got to consider the more damaging sort of ramifications. And I think at your point about it being completely accepted by the audience as being normal or not detrimental or not anything to really be concerned about was quite amusing, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why potentially it's being pushed as a form of predictive programming to get us used and accustomed to people living lives in this potentially quite unnatural way.
Yeah, I think that was fantastic. I do remember Pinocchio, and yeah, I think that's a fantastic comparison. That I'm gonna go and rewatch that movie now. I think I might even do an episode on Radio Visca about Pinocchio and compare it to some recent Disney films, because there is maybe there might be a quite an interesting lesson to be drawn from Disney films before Walt Disney relinquished control of the company, and Disney films after he relinquished control of the company. Specifically, I think recently it's been Michael Eisner, who's a Jew, running Disney. Yeah, that. Thanks for bringing that up. That's awesome. Yeah, I agree with most of what you said. In a way, this film is also a parable to today. Yes, the technology is slightly more sophisticated. We have bodysuits and virtual reality headsets in the movie, but by and large, it actually reflects reality today already. So, far from it being Columbus, Ohio, 2045, is Detroit 2018 any different? Is Chicago 2018 really any different? Is Los Angeles 2018 any different? Is Paris or London 2018 any different? The few images that you get are streets sprayed with graffiti, no recognizable ethnic majority, just a global, diverse, just mixture of people from all over the planet. No tradition, no large families, no nature. I mean, I think I couldn't see. I'm not sure if any trees or plants. Oh yes, there's okay. So the rebels, the so-called rebels, that are kind of trying to prevent this evil corporation from taking over the oasis. They have rooftop gardens, a few pot plants here and there, and that's the only time you really see nature. Pets or animals of any form, I don't think I saw any. Yeah. So, I mean, that's really the reality for most people today already. And so, if you look at, what could we, what does the Oasis stand for? Well, it stands for Netflix. It stands for Warcraft. It stands for Halo. It stands for Dota. It stands for Twitch live streaming. It stands for Counter Strike and Player Unknown Battlegrounds and all these games. That, I mean, there's hundreds of games, right? Thousands of games. Actually, there's probably approaching something like 100,000 or a million games almost. I mean, if you count every single game ever made. So there's this overwhelming amount of entertainment. If you add Netflix and interestingly, I have noticed a trend both in video games as well as Netflix programming to extend the amount of time that people need to invest in any given entertainment product. So, for example, with Netflix, you have this thing called binge watching now, right? Where it's no longer a movie you're watching, you're watching an entire series, and they immediately dump something like 12 episodes at 1 hour each on you. So there's 12 hours of your life you have to invest in this season, right? And then there's often like 5 or 6 seasons. And then they have these video games where there's this grinding aspect to it, right? First of all, there's the skills aspect where you have to really practice to be good at it to be able to do anything in the game. And then second, there's the grinding aspect where to get the better weapon, to get the better armor, to get the better, spell, you have to be in there and playing over and over again and earning more gold, or you have to pay for it. Which, let's be honest, if you pay for something, that's also costing you time, right? I mean, you spent time earning that money, right? So at the end of the day, what this type of entertainment promotes is quite similar to consumerism. It's the expropriation of the working class, both in financial and time resources, for things that have no purpose, that don't help them, that don't push them any further, that don't benefit them in their life. It's a sort of Sisyphus rolling up the rock, up the mountain, and then there's this interesting thing in Ready Player One where if you lose, you zero out. So in other words, you lose all the cash you've accumulated throughout the entire game, and then this kind of bankrupts people, and then they have to go to these loyalty centers. So that I found a potentially very evil kind of predictive programming, where there's this idea that your real finances depend on your success in a game. And I think we see stuff like that already developing now, where you have, for example, Sesame Credit in China, where increasingly your wealth and your success in life is dependent on all these digital scores, essentially. So those are just some of my thoughts. The last thing that I think I wanted to mention is there's this strange dichotomy as well in the movie where there's these two games companies essentially. There's Gregarious Games, and then there's IOI, which I think stands for information, I don't know, whatever, information something. And Gregarious Games is sort of shown as the good games company. So this company that created this oasis where everyone wastes all their time, they're good guys. And only the other guys that want to like monetize it more, they're the bad guys. So there's this. It seems like basically what Spielberg is saying is, as long as we're not charging you too much to waste all your time, you're the good guy, right? But if these other corporate guys that want to take over this oasis and they want to start charging you for everything in the oasis, well, those are the bad guys. But the fact that you're wasting your time in the oasis and you're not working on your own personal life, that doesn't matter. So yeah, I mean, I haven't read too many reviews. I'm sure this film's probably going to be, Jay Dyer might do a review on it. Who knows? Maybe the pause button might even feature this movie. But I think there will be a lot coming out on this film in critical reviews on the YouTube, and I'm looking forward to listening to what some other people have to think. But yeah, up to you.
Yeah, that's it. It's a really interesting point. I remember reading some research about how much time and effort goes into psychological research behind gaming, in terms of looking at measuring the variables for things like gratification or powering up or receiving a reward or the time between receiving those rewards and linking the success of the game to that timing. So I think there's a lot of research, and a lot of these games are designed to be addicting and to exploit and to make sure that people do invest a lot of their time into it. So we are all vulnerable to those rewards, some more than others, and the idea that you're not being exploited just because you're not being charged more money within a game to get to a certain level, or you're not being charged because you've got a particular DLC to be bought is probably wrong. I think it's important for young people in particular to be aware that they are potentially being exploited by these games. I mean, another point of the predictive programming point about getting people used to having a digital form of funds which is connected to an online world where they can be monitored and their behaviour and rewards can be monitored in the real life. I think people who are prepared to do that and are prepared to accept it are much more likely to be from a group who are already used to having a kind of online life, virtual life, whereby they are used to these kind of rewards and have normalised it without any kind of focus on the state itself and whether or not the state would run that kind of digital currency. And also just going back to the point on the morality. Here we've got, I guess, it's a completely new form of. It boils down to consumerism, really. It's the good and the bad is measured on to what extent you are able to consume without being charged too much. There's not really a great deal more to it than that. Whereas, like in contrast, you've got that tale of Pinocchio, which is an old European, I guess you'd say, moral framework, or I guess maybe an allegory, which had some real substance about what's going to make someone. The whole quest was to become a real boy. So what made this child a real boy, and part of that was overcoming potential addictions, overcoming potential exploitations, having empathy, self-sacrifice for others, and I don't think there was anything in that movie about getting a power-up within a computer game and whether or not there was actually a virtual or ethical, a tangent
think we've really touched on some really good topics here, some really good thoughts on this topic, Ready Player One. We should probably take a break and then move on to our next topic. This is part 2 of our epic dialogue with Tom Warrell and myself. And topic 2 for today is the founding fathers of the United States, and the question whether classical liberalism actually was ethno-nationalism originally. And so Tom Warrell has prepared something on that question that he wants to read, and has thought about this issue a bit. So I'll hand the microphone over to him now.
I think the basis of this discussion is a counter-argument to modern libertarian ideas, which is that liberty as a principle was to be supported for all peoples regardless of their cultural, ethnic, religious background. So, beginning with the ideas of potentially, John Locke and free market economics of Adam Smith, arose what is the modern libertarian movement, sort of supported by the Austrian economists, based on kind of property rights, low taxation, potentially no trade restrictions, and arguably open borders. And I think what we were just discussing before this podcast is the fallacy that the original proponents of the liberty or classical liberal ideas were not making those assumptions based on certain founding other principles. In particular, the idea that they would be supported and maintained by a white or European ethnic society. Now we know from a lot of the research that's been done on the propensity of people to vote for certain political positions that it's only really white males who, in a considerable majority, actually want social and economic liberty. Most other groups and women tend to vote for large centralized bureaucracies redistributing wealth and controlling society, and we see that influence increasingly throughout the West, as you have not only economic restrictions in terms of heavy personal taxation, but also limits on freedom, free association, affirmative action, and also limits on the rights to free speech and the categorization of some speech as hate speech, depending on what the subject is and who the speaker is. But I just wanted to read a quote from David Duke's book in the chapter My Awakening, from the chapter Rising Tide of Colour, where he mentions that Americans' first naturalization law, which, quote, our founding fathers enacted in 1790, mandated that an application for citizenship was for a free white person. And even the Declaration of Independence often refers to our British brethren, our common kindred, and our consanguinity. And in the original Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, described Americans as, John Jay in the first essay of the Federalist Papers refers to Americans as one united people, a people descending from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very, very similar in their manners and customs, a band of brethren. So what's recognised there is that if you have a certain group, a band of brethren, who have the same manners and customs, then not only are you more likely to establish and maintain a coherent nation, but the principles on which that nation had founded, for instance, liberty in the US, are more likely to be maintained. And there's no real consideration of multiculturalism, or the idea that, that band of brethren would be broken apart or faced with the influence of multiculturalism and what the potential ramifications of that are.
Yeah, I mean, I've never read. I have planned to read the Federalist Papers, and I've got them. I've just never gotten around to doing it. So it's great that you read that quote, and it read in the context of history at that point, 1790. founding colonies, founding initial New England states, it makes a lot of sense as well, because I mean, you were basically in the birth phase of the United States, so you were in the initial phase of what we could call ethnogenesis. You were there was essentially a process by which British migrants to America, Scottish migrants, were forming into a new ethnicity, the American people. And so this ethnogenesis had to, of course, define. There had to be some form of definition as to who are these American people. And there was obviously competition as well around. So you had the French to the north, you had the Spanish to the south, and you had the Native Americans to the west. And from the sounds of that, well, first of all, we know that none of these people, the Spanish, the French, or the Native Americans, were included in the new American nation after independence. So, you know, there was no offer to the Spanish colony to join. The American founding fathers saw themselves as clearly separate to the colonies in Texas and Florida and the Caribbean and Mexico. As did they see themselves separate to the New Orleans, Louisiana, or Quebecois, colonies. And we have to remember that these were whites. I mean, the Spanish were, largely Castilian. Which they basically are whites. And certainly the French were whites. So I would argue that the quote you read, is even more narrow than just white. It's actually Anglo-Saxon. It's actually British, and to then say that we can take this definition and apply it to all people on the entire planet is clearly a falsification of history.
And that shows why the libertarian movement is basically fallacious in that it doesn't take these serious issues into account. It kind of assumes that the principles of libertarianism will be adopted by all peoples, or should be, because they're sound principles. And I mean, I don't doubt that they are. Many of them are sound principles, but the point is that other people don't see them as sound principles. And in fact, we know that all the different ethnic, for instance, in the United States, many different ethnic groups support deliberately and organise on the basis of ethnicity. A couple of quotes from the same page in David Duke's book here is when Jesse Jackson and black and Mexican followers demonstrated at the University of California, they chanted, "Hey ho, Western culture has to go." And many immigrants also across Europe have the unabashed goal of altering Europe and America to resemble their native lands ethnically. In fact, you've got many different Jewish, Asian and black groups, and also in the US you've got La Raza, which is a group for Latinos, meaning the La Raza Unida, the united race. None of these people really take into consideration the libertarian ideas of economic freedom and also the social freedoms of freedom of association, freedom of speech, which have contributed to the success of some European nations and in particular America.
Yeah, I remember our conversation we had the other day on the phone where we basically decided we'd discuss this topic. It was in regards to the World Trade Organization and basically the question of whether autarky in today's age is possible and whether free trade in a modern world is actually possible. So basically, in regards to tariffs on China, tariffs on India, etc. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of the free trade ideology originated and was formulated in an age in which really only Europeans mattered. So if we look at the history of the world over the, say, last 300 years, Um, I mean, you really, there are no important players up until roughly 1950, I would argue, uh, other than maybe the Ottoman Empire, that are non-European. So I mean, all important players are European or European derived, as the Americans are, except for maybe the Ottoman Empire. And certainly the Ottoman Empire is close to Europe as well. Um, China throughout the entire period was a basket case. Japan was isolated. Korea was heavily, absolutely, terribly impoverished. India was completely completely splintered. I mean, it's important to remember that the India, as we know it today, is really only a creation of the British Empire. South America, for the most part, in terms of the people that mattered, was a European continent. In terms of Buenos Aires and Santiago and the colonies that were wealthy and were trading. And I'm talking about trade now. Now, this is not to deny that other people existed. I mean, that would be the sort of typical lefty argument you get. You're denying other people's existence, and that's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is trade, industrialism, and market economy, essentially. And that was largely a European affair, augmented by colonies, essentially, or European settlements. You didn't even have the Japanese until basically the early 1900s or the late 1800s. They were not a player. And certainly India and Pakistan and Nigeria and Iran and all of these countries were absolutely meaningless on a global trade basis. So really, the trade system was created in an age where Europeans were trading with each other. You know, the Dutchman was trading with the Brit, the French was trading with the German, the Spanish was trading with the American, etc. Now, sure, there were rivalries between these colonies as well. There were rivalries between these nations, and they did end in wars. But to a large degree, it was the same civilization. It was the same way of thinking. It was the same basic assumptions. Yes, there are differences between French and British, but there are many similarities as well, and there are many shared philosophical and cultural and religious similarities. Do these really exist between Brits and Indians? Do these exist between French and Chinese today? That's a question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think we're starting to see the sort of free trade regime break down, because as we witness in reality in Korea, in Japan, in China, the same stance is not taken. You are not, as a Western company, able to invest in China without giving up all your IP. You're not able to invest in Japan without going into a joint venture with a local company that basically has a controlling stake. As far as I understand it, even companies like Ford are in joint ventures where the Chinese company holds 51% of ownership over all the installations and factories. So these nations have simply not been abiding by free trade rules, and they are not making any indication that they will in the future. And if we look at what economic impact this is having, it's having a huge impact on trade imbalances. It's having a huge impact in terms of IP transfer. And at the end of the day, it's having a huge impact in terms of the movement of the industrial base and the movement of wealth transfer, essentially. There's significant social repercussions in terms of loss of jobs. And all of this rests on an old liberalist mindset that was created in a world that didn't have any non-white people trading, essentially. Yes, sure, there was porcelain made in China. Yes, sure, there was, there were these and a few things made here and there, but you didn't have active players in the age of colonialism the way you have now. And I think that got us onto this topic and really made us think about this. And I mean, how do you see the future going forward based on classical liberalism if that's taken to its logical conclusion with players like China and India?
I think not only economically but personally, you could argue that if you offer something or some kind of generosity or liberty to one person, but that person doesn't reciprocate, then you lose. For instance, if you were to invite someone into your house and share dinner with them, but then that person never invited you back to their house and reciprocated, you would be losing your resources and time and energy and not getting a reward for it. If you're offering free trade, low trade restrictions, and allowing imports from a certain country that isn't reciprocating in the same way and has restrictions against your trade, then clearly you'll lose. For an international capitalist or someone with an international corporate interest, as an individual, that might not be a problem, but if you're looking at a society or a country in general, the country that follows that rule is inevitably likely to lose. So, freedom in terms of economics is only really going to work where you've got two players, in a sense. And we have seen that considerably in the US and Canada, but also partly in Europe, in that, many industries and, manufacturing, for instance, but also service industries are being outsourced to foreign countries because of the cost. But we're not seeing a benefit, a real tangible benefit in many ways to the native populations. I mean, arguably you could say you're getting some cheaper products, or you're making it cheaper to do business on the one hand, but what's also happening is that you're losing a considerable amount of expertise and employment opportunities for the native population. And a kind of counterbalance or counterexample to this phenomenon is potentially what happened in National Socialist Germany, whereby the National Socialists essentially took control of the banking system, and to a large degree, although they had some economic freedom, they largely took control of the economy and tried to establish an autarky, which is a self-reliant, self-dependent economy, whereby the German country could supply most of the needs for produce or for services itself without having to rely on foreign influence. And we know that economically National Socialist Germany was wildly successful in comparison to the previous Weimar Republic, and that's partly due to the economic restrictions in a sense that you could say that were brought about by the National Socialists. So for instance, if you've got a country like China, whereby they have certain nationalist restrictions on migration, citizenship, but also who can control corporations within a country, but they're not reciprocated, then that's going to be beneficial for them domestically. But then you've got countries abroad which don't have those same restrictions, then they're going to be able to export to those countries freely and enjoy the success. So in a sense, I guess you'd say the country that maintains some kind of national principles above pure market economics and the drive for wealth amongst individuals is the one that's going to survive and is going to continue to be successful, potentially not economically, but also just socially and culturally.
Yeah, I think this is a valid criticism of free market, globalized free market capitalism in general, because, what does global capital seek? It seeks the lowest cost of production. Now, why does it seek this? We could argue due to competition, right? So, if company A has low-cost labor in China, but company B doesn't, then company A is going to, be able to sell the identical product for cheaper and totally bankrupt company B, right? So there's this sort of race to the bottom in capitalism and in economic systems, right? Now, what that sort of thinking does not worry about is the location of the factory and who has the monopoly of force in that particular jurisdiction. So we do live in a world where countries exist and where states exist, right? So you can't disconnect capital's drive for the lowest cost of labor from the realities of the legal jurisdictions where that lowest cost of labor exists. And this might be part of the reason why like capitalists are so keen on one world government, right? Because they don't want to have to deal with different jurisdictions, right? But nevertheless, you will encounter jurisdictions where the law, basically the people with the guns, will be able to treat you differently than at home, so to speak. So even though the labor there might be cheaper, it might actually come with the added demand that all IP is handed over, as we see in China, for example. And we know that. So basically, what you're dealing with is, I mean, capitalism, a free market really only works in a country where there's a sort of rule of law, right? Where there's the property rights are respected, right? So once you go across the border, and suddenly property rights are no longer respected in this new location, the free market kind of breaks down. And it's quite easy to illustrate this maybe with an example. Imagine you're sort of trading. You give someone some gold and they give you some wheat. But then you go to the sort of country next door and you give someone some gold and they give you some wheat. But then you pull the gun out and say you also have to give me the farm. Right? That's kind of what we're dealing with here. It's not free trade simply because the jurisdictions that are competing for the lowest cost of labor don't all have the same free market rules in the first place. So you basically got these gangsters that are taking advantage of the other sort of people who are adhering to the non-aggression principle, as it were.
I think an interesting parallel to draw to this point would be the ongoing negotiations for Brexit, whereby you've had the UK being a net contributor to the EU fund over the course of the last, I think, 15 years or decade at least. And now we're seeing that Britain will eventually emerge from the European Union, I believe, in 2020. But the current rules and laws will continue until then, and the deal up until then won't change things like the restriction on British fishing ships going into certain waters. Furthermore, Britain will be forced to pay an enormous amount of money into the EU as a kind of leaving fee, despite having paid in for the whole time that it's been in a membership and being a net contributor of funds. So what we see there is this idea that although the European Union was kind of founded on a kind of free trade or free market principle, actually it's much more restrictive and in many ways detrimental to British interests, and certainly and financially we don't they're paying in a lot more ultimately than what they're actually getting out of it. So it's all very well to say that we want freedom, economic freedom, low restrictions within a certain area, but realistically, competing interests will advocate for dominance or a hierarchy, and what we have seen, in my opinion, is a kind of bullying from the EU from the start, and now in the Brexit negotiations.
Yeah, the Brexit case is it's a complicated problem, and I think it's certainly something I want to go into maybe once it's complete as well. I mean, having this running commentary on it. I mean, it's just insanely complicated, and I mean, it just seems to be totally bogged down, the negotiations at the moment, right? And I think there's not much coming out in the news, maybe because there's a bit of a blackout on it as well, right? I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just not up to speed on it. But I kind of wanted to get back to the founding fathers and so the classic liberals, and sort of classic free trade theory. Because there's this additional angle that has always existed even in the free trade days. So when you read those quotes from the Federalist Papers, I mean, there's obviously the even at that time there's the what's being left out is that yes, maybe white Anglo-Saxon Britons or whites from Europe essentially were the Americans, were the new citizens, but these were obviously not the only people in the territory of the United States at that point. As we know, large numbers of black Africans were being shipped in on often Jewish-owned shipping companies into the southern parts of the United States. This practice, by the way, as far as I mean, I'm not totally clear on my history there, but as far as I understand, it did at some point end, and before slavery actually ended. So the actual new importation of new slaves ended before slavery itself was outlawed. And I guess what happened then is that just simply the children, the descendants of slaves became new slaves, and they tried to grow the population maybe that way. Potentially that's led to some of the admixture in the black American population. So what we have there is a non-citizen class that is essentially undermining the citizens' wage capabilities, right? I mean, this importation of foreign labor is really it's not a new idea, right? And it's interesting to see that slavery is universally reviled. The importation of these blacks, the transportation of these blacks to the United States is universally criticized, and it's quite obvious to anyone really, any lefty, anyone really that thinks about it, is that this was a way of gaining very cheap labor, basically only at the cost of feeding the slaves and housing them, and it was an economic had economic desires behind it. So when we then fast forward to today's age, and we see clear mass movements of low-skilled, low-wage men from Africa, actually, incidentally, as well, often, and from the North Africa and Middle East, to Europe and the United States, no parallels whatsoever are drawn by the usual critics of slavery, and I find that quite revealing. Now, obviously, I can predict the lefty reply would be, well, that's voluntary, right? Well, in the old days, the slaves were rounded up and put in chains, and that's a totally different idea, totally different scenario than people that voluntarily come to Europe. But we must remember that we also live in the age of social engineering. We live in the age of brainwashing. The same people that tell you that every single migrant that's coming to Europe is going voluntarily will tell you that we need laws against Coca-Cola and we need laws against advertising because people are not able to control their voluntary impulses of buying those items, right? So I would argue that what we're seeing with these mass migrations is actually from the perspective of capital. It is essentially an inversion of outsourcing. And I've been developing this idea. I think I brought it up during a meetup last week as well. I've been developing this idea for a while now that mass third world migration into Western countries is essentially a response to the East's, to China's, to Vietnam's, to India's, to Korea's unwillingness to play by free trade rules. So, in the past, companies would simply move their factories to China, to Vietnam, to Korea, to India, to Bangladesh, right? To Malaysia, and they would reap the benefits of cheaper cost labor, and therefore become more competitive. However, what these companies with time noticed is that they were enabling their own competitors. That with all the rules of IP transfer and with all the essentially creation of all this infrastructure in the East, they had created their own undoing essentially in the form of strong competitors, corporations in China, in India, etc. Right, and we see this, for example, now in the mobile phone space, where, I mean, as Motorola is owned by the Chinese. I think Lenovo is owned by the Chinese. Xiaomi, or whatever they're called, and various other companies are selling more phones than Nokia or Sony or Motorola or Apple. I mean, Apple still has an edge, but there is this trend towards, especially Chinese companies, using Western IP, having Western, outsourced factories for a while, but then basically overtaking the Western competitors. And this is not only this is also happening in Vietnam, in Korea, obviously, in India, even to some degree. It's astonishing to me as to how many Chinese and Indian-owned vehicle manufacturers are now offering their vehicles in Western markets. So what essentially I think the Western capital realized was that they needed to import this cheap labor so that they could be under their own jurisdiction, while still reaping the benefits of the cheap labor, essentially. And is this really any different to slavery from an economic standpoint? I don't know. Clearly there is a difference between making someone do something voluntarily, through advertising, through enticement, and just forcing them at the point of the gun. Sure, there's a difference there. But interestingly, if we look at other policies run by the West, for example, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan, in many of the source countries where many of these migrants come from, there's actually also sort of the stick approach. There's not just the carrot of, beautiful blonde pornography women, BMWs, welfare. There's also the stick being used in many of these countries, where, for example, in Libya, the standard of living was the highest in the entire of Africa, as far as I understand. And this was destroyed, and the people were put into absolute destitution, absolute poverty, and in many cases forced to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. So, sure, they're not being put in chains. Their house is simply being bombed. Is that really that different? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, clearly, I think people, obviously a literal slave has no choice to cross the Atlantic or to cross the Mediterranean, whereas now we see a lot of people coming in to Europe, for instance, from Africa, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the incentives to them are, in many ways economic, but also to do with security. So I think, obviously that is distinct from slavery in one sense, in another sense,
I'll just interject that I believe there is actually also slavery going on, right? There are slave markets where people are sent to earn money in Europe for slave holders. I mean, this is happening specifically in Libya, but yeah, just didn't want to interrupt you.
No, I agree. Modern slavery apparently is kind of rife within Europe. I know a lot of Eastern European women are trafficked out of Europe to places like Israel. But I think just going back to the idea of slavery, I mean, what's an economic slave if you don't? It's a difficult point. I'm not going to say that someone who moves from one place to another for economic opportunities is necessarily a slave, but you could argue that that level of ruthless kind of willingness to manipulate global geopolitics, for example in Libya, in order to potentially open up borders and open up markets for big corporate interests, and the social consequences and economic consequences on, for instance, the Libyan people as a result of that, would be very damaging and close to a form of economic slavery. I know for a fact that before, when Gaddafi was in power, he had a number of different rules which restricted corporations coming in terms of the amount of foreign labour that they could use and the wages that were paid to Libyan local labour. So there was a nationalistic control over corporate interests within Libya, which I understand have now been taken away, and Libya has been opened up to a certain extent to international corporations. So, the people who would have benefited from higher wages and greater security under Gaddafi have now been undermined because those laws aren't there to protect them anymore. Another point is when you look at Brexit again. Well, firstly, what happened with the opening up of EU migration in Western Europe was an enormous supply of Eastern European peoples, mostly working class, coming into the West to do cleaning jobs, more lower level label, but also tradespeople. And some research suggests that didn't actually reduce the wages within, for instance, Britain, but there's other research and also considerable anecdotal experience claiming that, as you'd imagine, when you increase the supply of something, the demand goes down and the price goes down. So a lot of people claim that they have been considerably undercut by that freedom of movement. When you contrast that to somewhere like Australia, for instance, where you don't have that constant or where you don't have as much of a direct influx of low-level labour, you see standards of wages, for example, amongst tradespeople being actually very high and very beneficial. They're in a sense protected, and they're not, as you say, exploited, or I guess your argument would be enslaved by complete open competition from every part of the world, or at least every sort of part of Europe. And one of the arguments amongst the left when it came to Brexit was the left was generally against Brexit, but there were the old school leftists who want to maintain a kind of trade union style control over labour and capital, and therefore use that to negotiate with the larger corporations. That having an open EU free movement of labour policy was detrimental to that potential control, because it would reduce the leverage that trade unions had over certain corporations. For instance, a lot of Poles came in and didn't join the union and then were prepared to work in different conditions for less money than the members of the union, which undermined their power considerably. So if socialist economics do, to a certain extent, protect the working class from that level of wage reduction and increase competition, and therefore keep their wages high, even if that is artificial, that is undermined by the free movement of labour. And then the constant the more predominant narrative amongst the left, which was against Brexit, was this idea that free movement of people should be allowed, and that it's racist if you don't promote it. And interestingly enough, that's completely in line with the interest of international banking and capital, who don't want any nationalistic sentiment to protect, for instance, countries in Europe from maintaining a kind of localized or dominant identity, which might actually resist weakening of social protection, economic protections for some of the working class.
Yeah, I think that analysis of the left in the UK is quite correct. One thing that I'm noticing here, though, and this is why I'm always skeptical of too much of a clear right-left divide and too much of a affiliation with one side or the other. I mean, we have to remember that the entire term right and left simply comes from the sides of the parliament, right? The opposition and those that were not who were in government, right? I mean, it's sort of a two-dimensional way of thinking that doesn't fit a complex economic world, right? And a world that's moved on. Like, I mean, the whole topic here is that these theories were developed in a time, also the right-left dichotomy, in a time where the world was much simpler and where maybe the issues were also more clear-cut. So yeah, it's very interesting because we were earlier talking about how the state, corporations are deemed the evil guys in the Spielberg movies, but the state is not looked at as in any way evil. And yet here we are talking about how corporations are using power and leverage and lobbying tactics to reduce the power of the state, at least at the border, right? That doesn't, of course, mean that the power of regulation over individual citizens sort of globally is being reduced, right? I mean, there's the difference between a powerful state that simply simply enforces tyrannical rules in a certain area, and a state that enforces a strong border, but then within the country is quite hands off, right? I mean, these are both powerful states in a way, but they behave quite differently, right? And it's quite interesting. Just as an aside, there's this whole idea of anarcho-tyranny, which is essentially a state that is anarchic in the sense that it doesn't enforce any of the laws that it should enforce, and tyrannical in a sense that it enforces all the bad laws that it shouldn't really be enforcing, right? I can't remember who the author of that. There's a guy that came up with the concept, and I think he wrote a book on it. And maybe some of the listeners can comment in the comments below. So, I guess where I was going with all this is that we are really facing a world where nations are under attack, right? And it seems like there are globalist banking interests, corporatist, capitalist interests that don't really need the nation state as a model anymore. They're kind of trying to break the nation state down, and they're trying to break ethnicity down. They're trying to... It seems like their aim is the homogenization of markets, the creating sort of monoculture of consumers, monoculture that English speaking or pidgin English speaking. There's this interesting term globish. I don't know if you've heard about that, which is this sort of simplified English of 1,000 words or so vocab. So maybe we'll use that term. I find that quite interesting. So basically, what this elite seems to want is this sort of globish speaking, ethnically diverse planet of virtual reality using consumers. I mean, am I too far off there, or yeah?
Well, I think that links back into what is a slave. If you've got a category of people who don't have any real culture, any real moral or ethical principles that they run their life upon, are atheistic, no real national allegiances, are motivated by entertainment as a way, as a way, as the goal of their life, to be entertained and to be hedonistic, what you have there is a people who are very easily exploited by those who have considerable power over states and governments, because they're not a cohesive group that would ever unify to resist any real form of exploitation. And how could they? Because when they don't actually have any significant kind of doctrine to keep hold of. You know, for instance, identity, tradition, culture, heritage, legacy, religion. If all of those have gone to the wayside and they're just this globish community of people speaking a basic language who have made into hate speech anything that might give them more kind of or a greater sense of identity, then those people could easily be, as you say, exploited. They could easily be, they're less likely to protect their own population from mass movements of labour. They've been told that it's wrong to do so. They're less likely to come together against, in the interests of international corporations. For example, in the in the banking crisis, there wasn't really much resistance as far as I can see.
Sorry, we're just passing the microphone back and forward here, so I'm apologising to the listeners for any kind of weird sounds that causes. We're in a bit of a low-tech studio here, but hopefully the sound quality is good enough. Yeah, so to respond to that, I sort of I have my problems with. I mean, I don't think that this is necessarily an entirely new direction. So let me explain. Now, obviously, in the 18th, 19th century, we had nationalism, right? In the 20th century as well, and I'm personally not actually a proponent of nationality-based nationalism, if that makes sense. Like, I don't see Dutch fundamentally as different to Germans. I don't see Danish as fundamentally different to Norwegians. I don't see British even fundamentally as different to Belgians. Like there's a sort of continuum of slightly changing visual characteristics over Europe, but by and large, Europeans are simply white. They're simply Europeans. And interestingly enough, Latin and German are the two main influences on all the languages of Europe, right? That's sort of the northern half in a way, and then you have places like England and France where both languages. I mean, there's Latin words in modern German as well, but certainly France and French and English are sort of an amalgamation of both, right? Both influences, whereas then Italy or Spain would only be Latin, and then maybe Norwegian or Swedish would mainly be Germanic, right? So there's really a European culture, right? I mean, there's also obviously Christianity, Catholicism. Again, interestingly, you have this sort of north-south dichotomy between Protestantism and Catholicism. So yeah, there's a continuum of gradual differences, but I don't think they align exactly with the national borders as they existed throughout the 18th and 19th century. Certainly there's language, but then again, language is also, to some degree, an accident of history, right, where it just matters what you learn as a kid, right? Whereas the peoples of Europe the borders have shifted a lot, and the peoples are racially fairly homogeneous, or have been at least so far. You have some brown-haired people and some red-haired people, but from a facial structure, from a genetic point of view, these people are all whites, right? And certainly everyone can realize that Denzel Washington is not one of them, for example, right? I mean, this is one of these leftist unreal arguments that really pisses them off, this sort of race as a social construct. I think that's entirely untrue. So I'm not actually a nationalist in that sense. I'm more of a ethno-tribalist or ethno-centrist, I guess, with sort of a biological worldview. And I would argue that nationalism itself has been used in a similar way to distract the workers from their real oppressors, right? So people were made nationalist, and then they were there, fighting their brothers on the other side of the Rhine, who may have the same great grandparents, right? Simply because they were told these are French and we're German, and we need to kill them. But when actually what was happening is that they were in debt, that their property was often expropriated. There was all sorts of feudalism and monarchy and all these kind of banking usury and all these kind of things that were the real oppressors, essentially, right? Not the other nations per se, right? So I'm actually not entirely against the concept of the EU per se, and I'm not entirely against the concept of sort of pan-Europeanism. However, what it appears to be panning out as in practice is really a sort of elite procurement of cheap capital, cheap labor, right? So what it seems to be really doing in reality, in practice, is that this modern transnationalism is destroying the traditions and the peoples of Europe, rather than letting them all sort of live as European peoples in harmony. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that maybe our solution should not be a return to the old school nationalism. Maybe our critique should come more from a sort of a pan-European resistance movement point of view, and that's still being formulated. But this is just me riffing here. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really interesting idea, because it's often the case that for example, in World War One, as you say, you had the jingoism, for instance, of the British government encouraging a lot of young men to go off to war when nothing significant was really achieved, and you had a lot of anti-German propaganda. But as you say, it was really just brothers killing brothers for no real benefit to themselves. And in hindsight, it would be difficult to identify what they were really fighting for and whether or not it was in their interests. And you can't really say that what the reasons that they did die for were particularly worthwhile in the long time. And that's not to denigrate them or anything for the sacrifice that they made. But I think maybe the distinction that you're drawing here is that you've got maybe three different ideas about what should be the founding principle for running a nation or a group of nations. One being the economic interests of the wealthy elites, which appears to be what the EU seems to be, and in order to achieve the interest of the wealthy elite, what they're doing is breaking down national borders, traditional national borders, cultures, identities, and the different ethnic groups, and making them mix with other groups and bringing other groups in order to basically create a slave class of people who can be easily dominated and exploited. And then, on the other hand, you've got the more old school traditional type of nationalism, which is like the idea that each separate group of people within Europe, for instance, had their own country, and the government of that country acted in the interests of those people and were aligned, and that they would be competing with other nations in order to achieve success. But I think, as you've kind of pointed out, that's kind of fallacious as well, when actually there's not any real significant difference between. I mean, there are differences, but to pitch one national group as, for example, the Dutch against the Belgians wouldn't really make sense from a biological point of view, or the point of view of what's actually in their interest. And then the third perspective, which you're kind of supporting, is this idea that actually we the peoples of Europe, for instance, have interests and an identity which is original, to themselves, and is to a certain extent shared, and having either monolithic, a monolithic government which just focuses on the economic interests of larger corporations, or having these kind of disassociated individual nations which only look after, which focus on the geographical distinctions between, a certain part of land, don't really resonate with the biological interests of the peoples of Europe. So, if you're going to, I think maybe, if you were going to have a state or a group of countries, or pan-Europeanism which was focused on the guidance of, what's specifically in the interests of the people as a whole, as an ethnic group, then that potentially could be a lot more productive than those two other former methods. One, the EU system that we have now, and then the former kind of British or nationalistic, kind of jingoistic focus on a particular small geographical area. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to break it down into those three categories. And I think it's important to. It is to some degree based on what our value system is, right? So, if you see Europeans as a maybe subspecies, a human subspecies that is fighting for its survival, you could start drawing parallels to the animal kingdom, right? So you could say, look, there's the Homo Europeanus or whatever, Homo Europeus or something like that, and obviously this is a very politically incorrect way of looking at things, because we're forbidden strictly from drawing any biological distinctions between any types of humans. But I think that's, if you look for comparisons in the animal kingdom, I think it's quite fallacious to say that the different races of humans don't have the same degree of certainly difference in appearance, but also in behavior and various other biological markers. And yet we are willing to subcategorize different bird species, different fox species, different dogs even, into fairly clear categories, but with humans apparently we're not allowed to. Now, if you look at, this really comes from a new sort of maybe way of looking at life, which values existence. And we were discussing this earlier. If you value existence, you can build up from. If you value your own continued existence, you can build up from this assumption to a larger construct of things that have to happen. So number one, if you value your own continued existence, you would value your DNA's continued existence, I would assume, right? Because you are really just a phenotype of your DNA. This would mean that you'd value having children. So continued existence would mean procreation. And as we know, there's all sorts of dangers. Children can die, offspring can die, they can be gay, they can have diseases, they can not be managed to procreate themselves, there can be accidents. So, unlike the sort of current thinking of the cat ladies in Europe, you need to have lots of children to secure existence, if we take existence as a primary value. Okay, having many children. Now, under which circumstances can you have many children? As we're seeing increasingly, and I think there's evidence is growing for this, white people do not do well in multicultural societies. They do not procreate well, or they interbreed. The amount of babies they have is certainly lower than any other competing ethnic groups, and they also tend to be penalized in many taxation ways. Basically it costs them. Multiculturalism costs. It's a tax. And as we know, imposing these kind of taxes and this kind of penalization reduces the birth rate. So it's directly in contradiction to our first axiom of what we value, which is existence. So you can sort of build up this entire structure of what needs to happen simply by valuing your continued existence. And I think not enough people do that. And you see that in nature, that animals live this way without even consciously thinking it through, so to speak, right? Like the Darwinistic survival of the fittest automatically demands this type of behavior from all animal species. And it doesn't matter whether it's a snow fox or a red fox. If the snow fox suddenly lets lots of red foxes into its habitat and just kind of like hides from them and hides away and plays video games and doesn't procreate anymore and lets the red foxes just run rampant and take all the food, the white fox is not, from an evolutionary point of view, valuing its own continued existence. I think this is really these are the fundamentals of what people should value, and they also happen to be the fundamentals of white nationalism. Now, I disagree with the word nationalism in that personally, but I presume that we're not going to be able to change that term. I've outlined earlier why I don't think nationalism per se is the correct term. We could say pan-nationalism, maybe. Maybe for me, white pan-nationalism is a better or more preferable term. Yeah.
It's amazing that we actually have, we've gone through the principles of the founding fathers and the idea that a nation would be founded upon an ethnically distinct group or brethren, and it's amazing that we've come to a time where all of the ideology and the international capitalist interests is kind of focused on putting a smokescreen around that fundamental principle, but it's even more fundamental, as you've just pointed out, because without having an ethnic identity as a foundation for any group or a species-centric identity within any biological group, that biological group would not continue to survive or have a territory. So it's fundamentally rooted to existence and is therefore probably the founding drive really for any species, and it's one that appears to be seriously lacking, or at least restricted and propagandized against in Western societies at the moment. I think that one group that has identified this for a long time and does very well on this point is the Jews, and if you read a lot of their literature, or for instance their websites, particularly Israeli websites, one constant question that you find asked about many different social, political, cultural issues is the question, is it good for the Jews as a group? So for instance, if it could be Brexit, or it could be the EU, or it could be the refugee movement, a discussion or an author or a journalist will put an article forward giving an opinion on whether or not it's good for the Jews, why it would be good for them, why it would be bad for them, and then if there's a general conclusion, Jewish groups in general and individuals will be either in support of it or against it. You never, at least in the mainstream, hear it argued whether or not mass migration to Europe is actually good for the indigenous native European people, and that's extremely damaging, because as you've pointed out, that question is fundamentally linked to the survival of native European people and as a group, as it would be for any other particular species. So if you don't have a nation that's asking that question for that particular group, then you can't have a nation, because that nation will cease to exist.
And more importantly, you can't have a people, And I think we're now entering an age where it's almost gotten down to the individual level of where you can't have a family. So I think there's something about white women, Northern European women maybe, but also Italians and general European women, where they are currently in this malaise of like, oh, there's all these migrants around, the jobs insecurity. I don't want to put children into this world, right? And if you put these children into the world, they are going to be a minority in the schools. They're going to be beaten up. They're going to be bullied, and they're going to be disadvantaged through affirmative action. And all of this is dressed up. It's, I think subconsciously even lefties notice this. I think subconsciously even the brain dead normies are somehow experiencing it viscerally, right? And it's sort of it's putting them in this state of malaise, this state of depression, right, where they don't want to procreate. It's like the pandas in the zoo, you know, like they're too encroached upon. They don't have the freedom of the bamboo forest, so they don't procreate. That's kind of how you feel when you wander the streets of London, and there's just all Muslims around you, and they're all wearing the veil, and you're like the only white person, and you just feel encroached upon, and you're like the panda in the zoo, you know, that can't feel free, can't feel safe to have a family. And I think especially amongst Northern Europeans that's quite important, because we tend to be case selected, so there's an emphasis on limiting procreation unless the conditions are ripe, essentially. And I mean that literally ripe, because I assume that this largely had to do with good harvests and harsh winters. So where probably women and also men, there was probably a certain level of self-control in not bringing further children into the world during periods of bad harvests in long winters, and then a focus on having more sex and more children, and you know, during periods of bounty, essentially, which, you know, historically throughout the history of a pre-civilizational Europe would have been over and over again, back and forwards, right? I mean, the weather's not predictable, right? The climate changes, and even hunting, in terms of hunting fish and elk and deer and whatever, move on, and you're not always given the same bounty by nature. You know, it's not predictable, right? Whether you're a farmer or a hunter-gatherer. So the harshness of the environment would have been, I think, a limiting factor on the willingness, on a subconscious, evolutionary, like instinctive level, to procreate. So if you create an environment that's threatening and with too many people, where there's this feeling that there's too many people already, maybe that actually has also an effect on less procreation. I mean, there's this interesting experiment, the Beautiful Ones, where they crammed a whole bunch of mice, I believe, into this maze, and it basically simulated overpopulation. And what it led to was that these male mice, they totally lost interest in procreating, and they just kind of withdrew into little corners and started grooming themselves all the time, right? And they were then called the Beautiful Ones. There's also an interesting theory that like urban overpopulation leads to homosexuality. This theory comes from observing dolphins, I believe, where if a school of dolphins grows too large, I think, or too dense, that homosexuality amongst those dolphins actually increases. And it's actually quite rare with the more spread out, smaller schools. So I'd have to. This is just anecdotal. I'm not totally read up on that, but it'd be something worth researching. Yeah, I mean, it's such a wide-ranging topic, and we probably should take a break soon. But do you have any closing thoughts on it?
I think that we've established clearly that if a group of people don't identify as within their ethnicity and use that as a foundation to their action and how they organise themselves, then that group of people will cease to exist. And any economic or, I guess you say, libertarian principles are a consequence of the activities and the will and desire of that ethnic group to maintain itself, not a cause. And I don't think that they're really distinct either. So yeah, that's my closing thought.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think many of these, if one drills down to a more fundamental biological level, right, the economic theories are just this sort of way of managing an ethnic group's flourishing, essentially. And so if those economic theories are turned against a specific economic group through subtle subversion, subtle alteration, then these economic theories need to be abandoned or modified. It's sort of a fallacy in thinking. It's you've got it all backwards, essentially. So people have it all the wrong way around if they put the survival of their people last and the economic theories first. Because actually it should be the other way around, right? The economic theories should serve the survival of your people. I think it's dangerously naive to think that all people on the planet are the same and we can just have economic theories that govern all peoples globally at the same time in this globalized kumbaya land. Because I think what we will find is that ethnic rivalries win out, and for example, the Chinese will simply dominate us, and then life for us as subjects of the colonial Chinese overmasters will suck, and we will only have our own idiotic economic theories of freedom to blame for it.